The tremor in his hand was almost imperceptible, a faint vibration against the polished obsidian of his desk. Beatrice saw it, though. She saw everything. It was her job. For 6 months, she had been Marco Moretti's private secretary, a ghost in his penthouse office, cataloging his quiet furies and the brutal efficiency of his commands. She managed the schedules of men who did not officially exist and ordered flowers for the funerals of their enemies. But today was different. Today, the stillness that was Marco's primary weapon had been fractured. The news from Chicago had come an hour ago. A betrayal. A territorial grab by the Russo family that was less a negotiation and more a declaration of war. He needed to be there, in person, by midnight. However, the world Marco Moretti commanded had shrunk to the size of his wheelchair. The accident that had taken the use of his legs and the life of his older brother, Luca, had also made him a pariah in the one place he needed to be. The sky. No pilot would fly him. The Gulfstream G650, the very plane where Luca had bled out beside him, sat pristine and silent in a private hangar at Teterboro. It was a multi-million-dollar monument to his failure, and the pilots, a superstitious breed, considered it a tomb. They called him the Broken Eagle. They said the sky had rejected him once and would do so again. His underboss, a thick-necked man named Sal, had just delivered the final verdict. No one, Marco. Not for any price. They're spooked. They think the jet is cursed. Marco's jaw tightened. The only outward sign of the rage Beatrice knew was coiling inside him. The silence in the office was thick enough to choke on. His empire was bleeding out, and he was grounded, trapped in a glass tower by fear and folklore. That was when Beatrice set down her pen. The soft click echoed like a gunshot in the tense room. Sal's head snapped toward her, his expression a mask of contempt. She was just the fat secretary, the girl who ordered his lunch and screened his calls, a comfortable, invisible piece of the office furniture. But she had a life before this, a life they knew nothing about. She rose from her small desk in the corner, her heart a cold, steady drum against her ribs. She looked directly at the man in the wheelchair, the man whose lethal power was currently useless. "I can fly the plane," she said. The silence that followed was a different kind. It was not tense. It was absolute, a vacuum where sound and reason had ceased to exist. Sal stared at her as if she had just grown a second head. 2 other soldiers in the room, men whose names she deliberately never learned, froze with their hands inside their jackets. But Beatrice's gaze did not waver from Marco. He had not moved, had not even blinked. His dark eyes, usually flat and unreadable, were now narrowed, boring into her with an intensity that felt like a physical search. He was dissecting her, peeling back the layers of her unassuming exterior, looking for the lie, the angle, the madness. She had been invisible for 6 months, a fact she had cultivated. Invisibility was safety in this world. Now she had just painted a target on her own back. He saw her plus-size frame, her simple black dress, her practical shoes. He saw the secretary. He did not see the girl who grew up in the dusty plains of Nebraska, whose father smelled of crop dust and oil, the girl who could stall turn a Cessna before she could legally drive a car. She held his gaze, refusing to be dismissed. This was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. She had a skill he needed, a key to the cage his own men had locked him in. After a lifetime of being overlooked, of being judged by her size and her quiet nature, she held the one thing that could save the most powerful man she had ever met. The corner of his mouth twitched, a motion so small it was almost imaginary. It was not a smile. It was the expression of a predator considering a new and unusual type of prey. "Get your coat," Marco Moretti said, his voice a low gravel. "We're leaving." The drive to Teterboro was silent and suffocating. Beatrice sat opposite Marco in the back of a black Escalade that smelled of aged leather and his sandalwood cologne. Sal rode shotgun, his hostile glare a constant presence in the rearview mirror. They did not believe her. She could feel their doubt like a change in the air pressure. To them, she was a secretary making a desperate, insane bid for attention, a fantasy that would fall apart the moment she saw the cockpit. She let them think it. Their disbelief was a shield. She focused on the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers against the light rain, her mind already running through pre-flight checklists. She knew this aircraft. She had arranged its maintenance schedules, paid its hangar fees, and renewed its insurance. She had read the accident report from the crash that had crippled him, studying the NTSB findings on wind shear and pilot error until she knew them by heart. She was not walking in blind. When they arrived at the private hangar, the Gulf Stream gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights, a long white shark waiting in the deep. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. Marco's men helped him from the vehicle into a different, more compact chair designed for navigating the jet's aisle. As they wheeled him toward the lowered ramp, Sal stepped in front of Beatrice, blocking her path. His voice was low and menacing. "You playing some kind of game? Because if you waste his time, if you get on that plane and don't know what you're doing," he let the threat hang in the air. Beatrice met his stare without flinching. "I'm not playing," she said, her voice even. "Now get out of my way. I have a plane to inspect." She brushed past him, the small act of defiance sending a ripple of shock through the men watching. She walked up the ramp and into the cabin without a backward glance, the scent of stale air and old fear greeting her. The interior was pristine, professionally cleaned to erase any trace of the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. But a feeling lingered, the cold echo of violence and loss. She ignored it, moving directly to the cockpit. She strapped herself into the pilot's seat, the worn leather cool against her back. Her hands moved with an assurance that was innate, a muscle memory forged over thousands of hours in the air. She flipped switches, tested gauges, her fingers dancing across the instrument panel. The avionics hummed to life, bathing the small space in a soft green glow. This was her world. Not the penthouse office with its hushed, deadly conversations, but this space, suspended between earth and sky, governed by physics and skill, not by loyalty and blood. She was running through the engine startup sequence when she felt his presence. He had been wheeled into the cabin and positioned just behind the cockpit, where he could see everything. She did not turn. She could feel the weight of his stare, the burning focus of a man who had nothing left to lose and was betting it all on her. She communicated with the ground crew through her headset, her voice crisp and professional, using terminology that Sal and his men would never understand. She was speaking a different language now, the language of command. Teterboro ground, Gulfstream November 92 Mike at Signature East. Ready for taxi to runway 19er. The response was immediate, a disembodied voice granting permission. She released the parking brake, and with a gentle push of the throttles, the massive jet began to move. It rolled smoothly across the tarmac, a graceful beast responding to her light touch. She did not look at him, but she knew the exact moment his doubt began to curdle into something else. The final checks were complete. She lined the jet up on the runway, the long line of white lights stretching into the rainy darkness. She took a breath. "Ready for takeoff," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She pushed the throttles forward. The Rolls-Royce engine spooled up with a deep, hungry roar that vibrated through the entire airframe, a sound of immense power finally unleashed. The jet surged forward, pressing her back into her seat. The speed was intoxicating. Faster and faster, the runway lights blurring into streaks. At the precise moment, she pulled back gently on the yoke. The nose lifted, and with a final, decisive movement, the Gulfstream left the earth behind. They climbed through the thick layer of clouds, the lights of New Jersey falling away beneath them. For a few moments, they were inside a gray, featureless void, the jet buffeted by the unstable air. Beatrice's hands were steady on the controls, making minute adjustments, feeling the aircraft as if it were an extension of her own body. Then they broke through. The clouds fell away to reveal a breathtaking panorama of stars against a canvas of perfect, inky black. The moon was a silver disk, bathing the cockpit in a serene, ethereal light. The roar of the engines softened to a distant hum. Up here there was only peace. The silence from the cabin behind her was profound. She risked a quick glance at the small rearview mirror above the instrument panel. Marco was watching her, his face half in shadow. The hard lines of his expression had softened, replaced by something she could not read. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was something more complex. Or perhaps, the raw, unguarded surprise of a man who thought he had seen everything, only to discover he knew nothing at all. He had been trapped, and she had just handed him the sky. After several minutes, his voice came, quiet but clear over the hum of the engines. "Where did you learn to do that?" It was the first personal question he had ever asked her. She kept her eyes on the horizon, on the curve of the earth visible even at this altitude. "My father," she said. "He flew crop dusters in Nebraska. Said it was more honest to fight gravity than to fight other men." The words were out before she could stop them. A piece of her old life offered up in the strange intimacy of the cockpit. She expected him to scoff, to dismiss the simple philosophy of a simple man. Instead, he was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of its usual authority, leaving only a raw, ragged edge. "My brother, Luca." He was in the co-pilot's seat. He did not say more. He did not need to. The ghost was in the cockpit with them now. Luca, the brother he had failed to protect. The reason this beautiful machine felt like a coffin. Beatrice understood. This flight wasn't just about getting to Chicago. It was an exorcism. He was confronting the very thing that broke him, and he had placed his life in the hands of his secretary to do it. Suddenly, a shrill alarm blared through the cockpit, and a red light flashed on the console. Hydraulic pressure failure. Beatrice's blood ran cold. It was a critical system. She immediately disengaged the autopilot, her hands taking firm control of the yoke. The plane felt sluggish, heavy. "What is that?" Marco's voice was sharp, all business again. "We're losing hydraulic fluid," she said, her voice tight with focus as she scanned the instruments. "It controls the primary flight surfaces. The flaps, the landing gear." She was already working the problem, rerouting power to the backup systems, her mind racing through emergency procedures. This was not turbulence. It was not mechanical failure. The system had been recently serviced. She had signed the work order herself. This was deliberate. Sabotage. Someone had wanted this plane to fall out of the sky, with Marco Moretti inside it. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The danger wasn't just a memory of a past accident. It was here now, 30,000 feet in the air. "We have to turn back," Marco commanded. "No," Beatrice said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Turning back takes us over the most populated areas, and we don't know how much control we'll have on approach. We need to land now." She was already banking the plane, her eyes scanning the navigation display for the nearest suitable runway. There was a small, private airfield in central Pennsylvania. Unlisted, probably used for smuggling or other clandestine activities. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. "There," she said, pointing to the screen. "That's where we're going." She was no longer his secretary. She was the pilot in command. For the first time, she gave him an order. "Strap yourself in tight. This is going to be rough." She did not see his reaction, but she felt the shift. He was a man who commanded, who never obeyed. But in this moment, his life depended entirely on her skill, her judgment. He was utterly, completely in her hands. The ground was coming up fast. The descent was a controlled fall. Beatrice fought the controls, the jet resisting her every input. Without full hydraulic power, she was flying on pure mechanical linkage, a wrestling match of strength and will against a 10-ton machine that wanted to die. She communicated with the unlisted airfield, her voice betraying none of the terror that was a cold knot in her stomach. They were expecting her. She did not say who she was, only that she was a Gulfstream in distress declaring an emergency. The landing was brutal. She brought the plane in too fast, unable to deploy the flaps fully to slow their approach. The tires screamed in protest as they slammed onto the tarmac, the smell of burning rubber filling the cockpit. She deployed the thrust reversers, the engines roaring as they fought to slow the immense momentum. The jet shuddered violently, skidding toward the edge of the short runway. For a terrifying second, she thought they were going to go off the edge into the dark woods beyond. But then, with a final, groaning shudder, the aircraft came to a stop. Silence descended, broken only by the frantic ticking of the cooling engines and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Her hands were shaking, her knuckles white where she gripped the yoke. They were alive. She had done it. She slowly went through the shutdown sequence, the familiar routine a comfort after the sheer terror of the landing. When the last switch was flipped, she finally allowed herself to lean back in her seat, her body trembling with adrenaline. She looked in the mirror. Marco was staring at her, his face a pale, unreadable mask in the dim light. His knuckles were as white as hers, gripping the arms of his chair. He had faced down death once before in this very plane and been broken by it. Tonight he had faced it again, and she had pulled him through. He simply said her name. Beatrice. The way he said it was different. It was not the perfunctory tone he used in the office. It was weighted, imbued with a significance that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the sound of a man seeing a woman for the first time, not as a functionary, but as a force. In that moment, she knew her old life was over. She had not just flown a plane. She had chosen a side. And the consequences of that choice were only just beginning. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere. The small airfield's operations building was little more than a shack with a flickering neon sign that read, Keystone Flight Services. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Marco's men, Sal included, were on their way, but it would be hours before they arrived. They were exposed, vulnerable. Marco was on the phone, his voice a low, lethal current of controlled rage. He was not shouting. He never shouted. He spoke in quiet, measured tones that promised surgical retribution. Find out who had access to the plane, he ordered Sal. I want a name, and when you have it, I want his family's names. Everyone he has ever spoken to. Do you understand me? Beatrice stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the dirty glass. She could hear the predator in his voice, the cold certainty of a man who dealt in death as others deal in commerce. A part of her, the sensible girl from Nebraska, screamed at her to run, to find a phone, call a cab, and disappear before his world swallowed her whole. But another part of her was rooted to the spot. She had seen the flicker of fear in his eyes during the landing, the brief human terror that he concealed so well. She had seen the man, not just the monster. The airfield manager, a paunchy man in a greasy jumpsuit, was being uncooperative. He wanted nothing to do with them, stonewalling Marco's questions about who else had been at the field that day. Marco's inability to stand, to physically impose his will, was a raw, visible frustration. He was a king confined to a throne, his power limited by his own body. He caught her eye from across the small, dingy waiting room. His gaze was sharp, an unspoken command. He nodded slightly toward the manager's office behind the counter. Beatrice, he said, his voice drawing the manager's attention. Get me a coffee. Black. It was a test. A line he was asking her to cross. While the manager was distracted, fumbling with an ancient coffee machine, Beatrice slipped behind the counter and into the small, cluttered office. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was not signing invoices or booking flights. This was conspiracy. This was a crime. She scanned the desk. A set of keys lay next to a logbook. She pocketed them, her fingers closing around the cold metal. She was back in the waiting room before the manager had finished pouring the coffee. She handed the cup to Marco, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of shared purpose. She had made her choice. She had not run. She had stolen the keys. The arrival of Marco's men was like the descent of a storm. Two black SUVs, bristling with quiet menace, rolled onto the tarmac. Sal and 3 other soldiers emerged, their faces grim. They immediately formed a protective perimeter around Marco. Sal's eyes found Beatrice, and for the first time, his usual contempt was replaced with a grudging flicker of respect. She had gotten him here alive. That was a currency he understood. It was Vinnie Gallo, Sal reported to Marco, his voice low. From the maintenance crew. The Russo family got to him. They knew your schedule. They expected you to fly to Chicago today, betrayal from within. The deepest cut of all. Marco's face was carved from stone. He gave a series of clipped, brutal orders. The keys Beatrice had stolen gave them access to the airfield security office and its camera footage. Within minutes, they had an image of the man who had met with Vinnie Gallo. It was one of Russo's top enforcers. But there was something else. A second car had been waiting at the edge of the airfield, arriving just minutes after their emergency landing. They were being watched. Russo had a backup plan. The enemy was not in Chicago. They were here. The realization had barely settled when the lights in the building went out, plunging them into darkness. The sound of an engine revving outside was followed by the shattering of glass as the front window exploded inward. Gunshots erupted, the deafening cracks echoing in the small space. Marco's men moved instantly, returning fire, their movements practiced and economical. Sal shoved Beatrice to the floor behind the counter, the smell of cordite sharp in her nostrils. But her eyes were on Marco. He was a target, isolated and immobile in his chair. One of Russo's men was flanking their position, coming through a side door, his weapon raised. He was moving straight for Marco. There was no time to shout a warning. Beatrice acted on pure instinct. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she moved away from cover, toward a set of large, red fuel canisters stacked against the wall. She knew what they were. High-octane aviation fuel. She grabbed the nozzle of the nearest one and twisted the valve. A stream of gasoline gushed onto the concrete floor. Then, she shoved the heavy canister over, sending it rolling directly into the path of the advancing gunman. He hesitated for a fatal second, his eyes widening as he saw the rolling canister and the spreading pool of fuel. That was all the time Sal needed. A burst of gunfire cut the man down. The diversion had worked. In the chaotic aftermath, Russo's men were either dead or had fled. The immediate threat was over. Beatrice was pulled to her feet by one of Marco's men. Her dress stained with grime, her ears ringing. The adrenaline was a wild, metallic taste in her mouth. They bundled Marco into one of the SUVs. Beatrice was pushed in after him. The door slammed shut, cocooning them in silence and darkness as the vehicle sped away from the airfield and back toward the highway. She sat across from him, the same way she had on the ride to the airport. But everything had changed. The space between them was no longer just a few feet of leather upholstery. It was a battlefield they had just survived together. She had not just been a witness to his world. She had become an active participant. She had stolen, created a diversion, and directly saved his life. He was looking at her, his expression unreadable in the intermittent glare of passing headlights. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. She expected him to say thank you. She expected him to acknowledge what she had done. He did neither. "You should have run," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "When the lights went out, you should have run out the back." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of what any sane person would have done. Beatrice met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty she had never felt before. "You didn't hire me to run," she replied. Her voice was steady. It was not a clever retort. It was a truth. It was the answer to a question he hadn't asked. It was a pledge of allegiance. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw it again, that flicker of something other than cold control in his eyes. He had offered her an exit, a chance to reclaim her ordinary life, and she had refused. The confession was not in words, but in that shared silence. They both knew a line had been crossed. She was no longer just his employee. She was his, and he was terrifyingly hers. The SUV sped on through the night, carrying them deeper into a world from which there was no longer any escape. They did not fly to Chicago. They drove. The risk of another sabotaged plane was too great. The meeting with the commission had been moved to a neutral location, a secure steakhouse in a desolate corner of Indiana. The change of venue was a message in itself, a concession Marco Moretti would never normally make, but one that was necessary for survival. Beatrice was left in the hotel suite, a gilded cage with a king-sized bed and a view of a parking lot. 2 of Marco's men stood guard outside her door. She was not a guest. She was an asset under protection. Or a prisoner. She wasn't sure which. She paced the room, the adrenaline from the shootout having long since faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a humming anxiety. She replayed the events at the airfield, her own actions seeming distant, as if they had been performed by someone else. The ease with which she had stolen the keys, the cold calculation of using the fuel canister. A part of her was horrified, but another, larger part felt a strange sense of rightness. She had acted. She had survived. She had protected him. She sat at the desk and turned on the small laptop one of the guards had provided. On instinct, she began to dig. Using the flight logs and maintenance records she had memorized, she cross-referenced them with the employee files she still had access to on a secure server. Vinnie Gallo, the trader, was a low-level mechanic. He wouldn't have had the access or the knowledge to sabotage the hydraulics so precisely. He had help. Someone higher up. Someone with pilot credentials. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She found him. A charter pilot named Rick Jensen who was on the payroll as a consultant. His records showed he'd inspected the Gulfstream 2 days before their flight. His financials, which she accessed through a series of ethically questionable searches, showed a recent massive cash deposit from a shell corporation linked to the Russo family. It was the proof Marco needed. Not just that Russo had tried to kill him, but that he had corrupted Marco's own organization to do it. But how to get the information to him? He was in the middle of a sit-down, a delicate negotiation where any interruption could be seen as weakness. She couldn't call. She couldn't send one of the guards. It had to be subtle. She typed out a short, coded message, referencing a specific maintenance part and an invoice number that corresponded to the date of Jensen's inspection and the amount of the deposit. It was meaningless to anyone else, but Marco, who had a photographic memory for his own business dealings, would understand. She sent the message to Sal's secure phone, with the simple instruction, "Show this to him." Now then, she leaned back and waited. She had just thrown a grenade into the most important meeting of Marco's life. The wait was agonizing. An hour passed. Then 2. Beatrice stared at the hotel room ceiling, tracing the faint water stains, her mind a whirlwind of possible outcomes. Had the message been received? Had it been understood? Had she just signed Marco's death warrant? Or had she handed him the weapon he needed to win? Just after 2 a.m., the door opened. Sal stood there, his face impassive. "He wants to see you," he said. He led her not to the SUV, but down a service elevator and through the hotel's cavernous kitchen, the air thick with the smell of grease and disinfectant. They emerged in a private dining room at the back of the steakhouse. The air was blue with cigar smoke. Marco was at the head of a long table, his wheelchair positioned for command. Seated around the table were 5 other men, their faces hard, their suits expensive. These were the heads of the other families. The commission. One chair at the far end of the table was empty. Another man stood behind it, his face pale with sweat. Beatrice recognized him from the files. Rick Jensen, the pilot. And seated to Marco's right was an older, florid man she knew from photos was Lorenzo Russo. He was not looking at Marco. He was staring at the empty chair beside him where his top enforcer, the man from the airfield security footage, should have been. The room was utterly silent. The tension was a living thing, a predator coiled in the center of the table. Marco did not look at Beatrice as she entered. He gestured to Jensen. "Tell them what you told me," he said, his voice soft as silk and just as strong. Jensen began to talk, his voice trembling. He confessed everything. The sabotage, the payments from Russo, the plan to have gunmen waiting at the airfield. He had been the inside man, the one who had assured Russo that Marco's plane would never make it to Chicago. Lorenzo Russo's face had gone from red to a pasty white. He started to bluster, to deny, but Marco held up a hand, and the room fell silent again. "My secretary," Marco said, his voice calm, conversational, "is a very meticulous woman. She noticed an irregularity in an invoice you signed off on, Lorenzo. For a consultation with a pilot who, it turns out, was also on your payroll, he slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout of the bank transfer. Russo stared at it as if it were a snake. The proof was absolute. Undeniable. The other family heads looked from the paper to Russo, their expressions cold. Russo had not just made a move on Moretti territory. He had broken the rules. He had targeted the head of a family in a way that was cowardly and dishonorable. He had brought an outsider, a pilot, into their world. Beatrice stood by the wall, a silent witness. She had not fired a gun. She had not made a threat. She had used her mind, her attention to detail, the very skills that had once made her invisible. And with a single email she had dismantled an empire. The head of the commission, an old man with eyes like chips of flint, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Marco. Permission was granted. Judgment was rendered. "Sal," Marco said, still not raising his voice, "please escort Mr. Russo and Mr. Jensen outside. They seem to be feeling unwell." Sal and another man moved with quiet efficiency. Russo began to protest, his voice rising in panic, but it was cut short as he was hauled from his chair. The door closed behind them, and the men at the table calmly resumed their conversation as if nothing had happened. Beatrice knew she had just witnessed a death sentence being passed, and she was the one who had signed it. The flight back to New York was on a different jet, a chartered Challenger, smaller and less opulent than the Gulfstream. The mood was subdued, the silence in the cabin no longer tense, but heavy with the finality of the night's events. The Russo family was broken, their assets already being carved up and absorbed. Marco had not just survived. He had profited, his power now more absolute than ever. Beatrice sat staring out the window at the blanket of clouds below, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. The woman who had boarded that first flight, the quiet secretary from Nebraska, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone colder and more capable than she had ever imagined. When they landed at Teterboro, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. Instead of taking them back to the city, the car drove them to the hangar where the Gulfstream was parked, now under heavy guard. A team of mechanics was already swarming over it, repairing the damage. Marco had them take him up the ramp and into the cockpit. Beatrice followed, her footsteps hesitant. The small space was filled with the morning light. It no longer felt like a tomb. Marco wheeled his chair into the position behind the pilot's seat, the same place he had sat just a day before. He looked at the complex array of instruments. Then he looked at her. "They told me this plane was a coffin," he said, his voice low. "My own men believed it was cursed." He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. "They were wrong. It's a throne. And you," he said, the words deliberate, each one weighted with meaning, "are the only one I will have at the controls." It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more potent. It was a declaration of trust. In his world, trust was more valuable than money, more powerful than fear. He was offering her a piece of his kingdom, a position of power no one else could hold. He was giving her a choice. She could walk away now. He would not stop her. He would give her enough money to disappear, to start a new life anywhere in the world, a life free of violence and fear. She could go back to being the anonymous woman she once was. The door was open. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face, the unyielding strength in his eyes, and the subtle vulnerability of the man trapped in the chair. He did not see a plus-sized secretary. He saw the woman who had saved his life, who had faced down death with him and had not flinched. He saw her. Beatrice thought of her old apartment, her quiet, predictable life, the grayness of it all. It was safe. It was empty. Then she looked at the pilot's seat, at the controls that felt so natural in her hands. She thought of the feeling of the jet leaving the earth, of the absolute freedom of the sky. Here, in his world, she was not invisible. She was essential. She was powerful. She did not give him an answer in words. She simply moved past him and settled into the pilot's seat. Her hands came to rest on the yoke, her fingers finding their familiar places. She looked at him over her shoulder, a silent understanding passing between them. The choice was made. She was not running. She was home.